Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Heritage University. My name is Melissa Rogers, and I'm the Vice President of Business Development for Heritage Property Management. And we are so glad that you are joining us. Today, we are going to be talking about all things Robert's Rules of Order. So if you have been joining us in 2022, the last several months, we've been doing a fantastic breakdown in great in-depth detail for the roles and the responsibilities for running an association, being a board member, community governance, and how to run board meetings. So we thought that this would be a perfect time because it is budget season, and for many of you, annual meeting season, to really talk about the parliamentary procedure for how it is as boards of directors that you come along and make decisions and where you find that governance from. So we are very excited. I always love when this happens to have a fantastic law firm, Luter, Larkin and Hunter, joining us, and more specifically, partner Cynthia Hodge is going to be talking to us today about a great summary for each of you. Robert's Rules of Order, I would say, in 60 minutes, so to speak. So this is a fantastic class that has been shared with our managers if you are a Heritage partner. So everything that you're going to be hearing today has already actually been taught earlier this year to your CAM. So feel free to engage in any dialogue that you have. So quickly, as we get into the presentation, we are going to be taking questions throughout the presentation in the text box, but we are going to wait until the presentation is finished in order to answer the question. So we want to make sure that Cindy has the opportunity to get through the great content, and then we'll take the questions at the end. So the question box is going to be located in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. And while Cindy is a fantastic attorney, she might not be your attorney. And so therefore, if you have any questions that arise from the communication tonight, please make sure that you consult your community manager or more specifically, your association's attorney if you need any clarification specifically to your association. Hopefully tonight we're just going to be really talking about process and protocol more than anything. So without further ado, I will now introduce you to Cynthia Hodge.
Thanks, Melissa. Good evening, everyone. I hope that you are able to hear me. I'm so excited to join everyone here at Heritage and Heritage University. I hope that I can help answer a number of your questions. And we're going to go through my presentation that I have actually gone through with the managers at Heritage several months ago. They asked some great questions, and I hope that I can incorporate some of those into the discussion today. It's about a 40-minute presentation, truthfully. And then what I hope to do is have a good solid 15 minutes of being able to answer any and all of your questions as well. I will specify I am a partner and I am an attorney. I've been doing it for a long amount of time, despite the fact that my lighting makes me look much younger than I really am. I've been practicing for about 17 years. I'm not a parliamentarian by trade. It's basically because of what I do that I have kind of learned how to do Robert's Rules, at least for association governance. So please know that this is very tailored to HOAs and condos and townhomes and POAs because obviously you are part of a community, and this is just something that is very relevant to how we run business and how we run meetings. And I hope that I can shed some really good light into how to do that. So with that, Josh, if you could go to slide 3 for me, that would be great. All right, so everyone, just so you know, the purpose of this meeting, and I'm going to go through my objectives in the next slide, is we're going to go over Robert's Rules for association board meetings. Now, I have to start at the basics and I have to work my way up, meaning we're going to start at why do we have Robert's Rules, go over some basic terminology, and then build into how does it apply to associations. And lastly, I'm going to give you a cheat sheet at the very end as to how to do certain motions and what is required for each motion. And these are going to be the most common things that you find in a community association. So with that, let's talk about our objectives. So Josh, if you could go to the next slide, please. And if you could click through, there are 4 objectives. So if you want to click through those for me, I'll go through them right now. All right, so Why do Robert's rules come up in an association context? I need us to focus on that because we get that question a lot. I have been to countless meetings where there is a homeowner who wants to know, do we follow Robert's rules? Why do we have it? Why aren't we following it? All of those types of things. So the first question I have to ask is the why. Why do we even have it? Why does it come up? And then we're going to talk about the when and where. When do we use it and when should we use it? Again, there's going to be some conflict between what our governing documents say and what Robert's rules say. We're going to go over that. Then we're going to talk about the what's. What are some of the basics for using Robert's rules? I'm going to talk about 3 main important motions that we have to know in an association context. And then lastly, I want us to think about how we can sound smart using Robert's rules, right? There's lots of people who want to use and point out and point of order and point. Let's understand what it means and how we can sound smart using it. And if that, we'll go ahead to the next slide, Josh. So as this is coming up, if you want to click through, that would be great. All right, so first off, when did this all begin? And the reality is that it began way back when in 1876, if you can believe it. So Robert's Rules was initially published back in 1876 by an engineer and Army officer, Henry Martin Robert. And it was based on proceedings of the US Congress and created to meet the needs of the non-legislative body. Okay, so why did we have it? Well, it was supposed to manage meetings and create organization. It was supposed to allow all members to have votes heard equally, majority vote rules, protecting rights of all members of these organizations, and to try to, as you could think about it, doing one item of business at a time. That was really the whole purpose. So this has been around for a long time. Josh, if you turn to the next slide, we'll talk about how many revisions we've had since. There have been at least 12 editions. The most recent actually was in September of 2020. If you can believe it, because of what had taken place with COVID and all of the virtual meetings and the necessity of it, they actually had to do some revisions to Robert's Rules to try to reflect and modify and update it for those virtual meetings. So the version that I'm going to be referring to is that latest version from 2020. We do usually see them every few years, but just so you know, but when you see in my presentation, if you see RONR, it just is the abbreviation for Robert's Rules of Order newly revised. So if we could go to the next slide, Josh. Again, a little bit of humor. You should be familiar with Robert's Rules. Most associations do have reference to it in their bylaws or not. And if not, it's still there as a great tool. So let's go into the next, what and when do we need to use it? All right, so to begin, there are some common issues that can arise. Number 1, an owner or board member uses Robert's Rules as a weapon. I have personally been at meetings where I have seen this taking place, where there is actually, almost a verbal dispute between a homeowner who's trying to use Robert's Rules to try to circumvent what maybe the board is wanting to do. And that can be a problem. Now, oftentimes what I can do is I can intervene. Even though I'm not running the meeting, I can help the board. And usually that's what I'll do is help the president to be able to facilitate whether there can be an interruption and we'll talk about that in a little bit, or whether we even need to entertain whatever is being interrupted or suggested or motioned. So again, sometimes some of the issues that rise in an association context are people try to use it as a weapon. They try to use it to overthrow. They use it to try to control. We don't want to do that. Robert's Rules really is more for organizational purposes, and we need to know how best to use it. I hope I can give you some tools tonight to do that. Another issue that arises often is failing to restate motions at proper intervals. That's the president's job. We're going to talk about that and hone in on that in a little bit. But the reality is that when there are motions being made by owners or other board members, not the president, it is the president's job to restate those motions and make sure that whatever is being discussed is properly summarized. It's a usual issue that I've seemed to find people missing just because they don't really realize they're supposed to do it. So again, I'm hoping that I can educate you all a little bit on what you should be doing at that juncture. Another issue that arises in HOAs is we go too fast at a meeting, right? Either we've gone too long because we've been talking about something, and then all of a sudden we realize we need to accomplish 3 or 4 other things, and we only have 15 minutes left before we need to leave the library, or before, you know, the virtual meeting is over, something along those lines. So the truth is that sometimes either we can go too long or go too fast at a meeting, and we're not paying attention to what needs to take place. So this is another issue that I see from time to time. Another issue that arises is biting off more than we can chew. Now that's going to come in more for an actual main motion and amendments to a motion, meaning let's say there's a project. We're going to go over a specific example in a little bit. And sometimes people will get grand ideas and they'll want to add to things and change things, but they're not doing it the proper way. We don't amend the motion, we don't restate it, those types of things. Sometimes we can, again, bite off more than we can chew in what we are trying to accomplish. Remember, everything should be one at a time. So even if we have, let's say, a project that we want to do, we want to focus on one step of that project first and then move to the next one. And that's where we run into problems. It's like a run-on sentence. You know, it goes and goes and goes and goes and goes, and we can't really contain it all that well. So again, it goes into my last common issue as well, just being too wordy when we're stating motions. Either we're biting off more than we can chew, meaning we've added too much and we can't take it all in, or we're just being too wordy and we put too many things in. Again, a lot of this sounds like I'm talking about a grammar lesson or anything else, but you'll see what I mean when we get to these actual motions. But these are the most common issues that I see in meetings in association context. Now, let's go to the why. Why do we use Robert's rules in associations? Okay, the reason is most governing documents say so. Okay, that makes sense, right? Most of your governing documents probably say it. Maybe not in the declaration, but usually in your bylaws, right? Your bylaws are it's your working document. It's how you run your business. You run your corporation. It'll tell you how to do meetings and quorum and proxies. That's usually where you're going to find a reference to Robert's rules. The older the document, maybe the less likely that you see it, but Robert's rules still exist and you can still defer to it. You could even pass a resolution as a board to say that you will try to utilize Robert's rules so long as it doesn't conflict with your governing documents. Here are some examples. These were actually pulled, one from a set of documents we usually prepare for our clients, and others were other communities that I have that I just literally pulled. This is what it looks like. So it'll say order of business. All meetings should use Robert's Rules of Order, latest edition, when not in conflict with the declaration, bylaws, or articles, right? Same thing. Some will say parliamentary rules, conduct of meetings. So these are all examples. Most times you will find it in your bylaws. But again, if you ever have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out to your manager or your association's attorney for guidance on that. Josh, I can go to the next slide. All right. Now, Robert's rules should govern unless it conflicts with Georgia law, the declaration, the articles, or the bylaws. Now, that's easy for me to say, right? It's easy for me to say that. It's like, oh yeah, unless it conflicts. What does that even mean? Well, typically what will happen, and Josh, if you go to the next slide, I actually give you all some examples of this, because this is really important to understand what happens. So here are some examples. One is voting on the agenda. I have another one, members speaking at open board meetings. The third one, calling for roll call when when you're voting is a secret ballot. So let me go through each one. So typically, Robert's rules will actually say that for agenda purposes, the membership is supposed to vote on the agenda. Now, that conflicts with probably the vast majority of governing documents. The reason being is that it will usually say that there's already a pre-made agenda, or that the board can adopt that and move forward with it. So this is a typical example that I would use to say you're not really going to be voting on the agenda at a membership meeting or even at the board meeting, so long as there's really not any conflict. So again, one example would be the governing documents will control over Robert's rules for agenda purposes. Another example is members speaking at open board meetings. Remember, Georgia law does not say that all board meetings have to be open. There is no law that says that. What you have to do is you have to go to your bylaws and look to see if there is a provision that says you have open board meetings. If there is a provision that says that, then you need to have open board meetings. If you don't, there is no requirement for it. So if you have a provision that says you have open board meetings, members are not really supposed to speak at these meetings unless they have been either added to the agenda ahead of time, or you have given permission to be added at that meeting. Meaning, let's say the board says, if you would like to speak, please come before the call of the meeting and be added to the agenda, or we will give you an opportunity to, raise your hand and speak. So you'll give them an opportunity to do it. Otherwise, for open board meetings, all non-board members are really flies on the wall, right? They're just there for observation purposes. Now, in Robert's rules, most meetings, especially informal or formal, members would be allowed to speak no matter what, if they were recognized by the president. It just doesn't work that way in association context. So again, if you have open board meetings, just remember that your governing documents are going to probably conflict with Robert's rules in that sense. And again, members do not get to speak unless they are specifically provided to speak, either ahead of time or with the permission of the board. Another example is calling for roll call vote when voting is secret ballot. A lot of times our governing documents will refer to secret ballots, or that we need to have that be private. Calling for roll call vote is a very common thing in Robert's rules. It really doesn't apply in the association context, so we don't really utilize it that way. Really, roll call is used for more attendance purposes for board meetings, but not necessarily for a membership meeting. So again, this would be a simple example of why it would conflict with association governance. Josh, if you could go to the next slide, please. All right, so, whoop, there we go. I was going to say, I didn't go that quickly. Do we need to use it even if the governing documents are silent? This is a common question that I asked that I wanted to make sure that I addressed with you, because it's a great question. And a lot of homeowners ask that, say, okay, my governing documents don't say we need Robert's rules. Do we need to use them? Best practice says yes, so long as the actions do not conflict with governing documents. Again, the reason for Robert's rules is for organization, right? It's to make your meetings run more smoothly and keep to a better strategy of taking one step at a time instead of trying to, again, take on more than you can chew, biting off more than you can chew. So my tip, my first tip would be using Robert's rules to help resolve certain issues. Use it to keep a schedule, keep organized meeting format, or use for agenda purposes, right? There can be examples for agendas. My big thing for meetings is really trying to keep proposed timeframes. When I have either attended meetings or have helped facilitate meetings, or even run my own meetings for other organizations, one of the best keys is to be able to have like timeframes, proposed timeframes for each subject, for each order of business, right? For new business, for old business, et cetera. It just helps to make sure that the meeting is running. It doesn't go too long, basically. So again, best practice says yes, so long as the actions taken do not conflict with the governing documents. I usually highly recommend it, but again, there's not a specific requirement. It's just best practice. Josh, if you can go to the next slide for me, please. Now, quick recap. I like to try to touch base. I apologize because I know I'm staring at a green dot, but I'm hoping that I can, feel like I'm being seen by all of you. After I talk for a few minutes, and again, it's been about 15 minutes, I like to just do quick recaps, right? Just to kind of summarize what I've said, and not feel like, you're just constantly hearing me talk for 45 minutes. So, quick recap. Will Robert's rules control at every association? It will up to a point. If it conflicts with Georgia law or the governing documents, if those conflicts arise, then obviously Georgia law and the governing documents should control. So that's how we want to utilize that. Perfect world scenario, we'd have boards adopt rules and regulations regarding meeting procedures and incorporate the best aspects of Robert's rules, right? That's really what we want to focus on when we think of association governance. It's let's focus on the best aspects of Robert's rules, not the minute, random rules of that huge book that we have as our 12th latest edition. So again, Josh, if you can go to the next slide for me. Let's do a quick review. When do we actually use it? And this is kind of a association governance 101 recap, right? When do we use it? First off, we use it for association membership meetings. These are typically considered in Robert's rules world like formal meetings because they're usually more than 15 people. Depending on your community, of course. I do have some where, I only have a 13-unit condo building, so maybe it's, less than 15 even then. But association membership meetings are either annual or your regular meetings, right? You have to have an annual membership meeting by law every year. or within 6 months of the end of the fiscal year or 15 months from the last meeting. Technically, that's what the statute says, but let's put it in perspective. We have an annual meeting every year. We are supposed to bring members together and allow them to understand what took place that year and the future year. So that's definitely a great use, is at your annual meeting. And many of us are starting to plan our annual meetings. This is annual meeting season and budget season right now. Another example is special meetings, right? Remember that special membership meetings are ones called for a very specific purpose or a special purpose. It could be for a specific election of the board, or it could be for levying a special assessment, or it could be for passing an amendment. These are examples of some for removing board members. That's another use of a special meeting. So special membership meetings, also a very good opportunity to be able to utilize the best aspects of Robert's rules. And then also too, I put in adjourn meetings, meaning let's say we have, we're close to quorum. We have our annual meeting, we're close, we're not quite there yet. We think that we could be able to adjourn this meeting and reconvene within 30 days and be able to get quorum. So again, Robert's rules would apply for that purpose in adjourn meetings as well. Josh, if you can go to the next slide for me. Now, of course, that's membership meetings. Then I want to turn to board meetings, because if anything, board meetings probably are, it's probably used even more frequently in the board meeting context, so that we can run, be able to run meetings smoothly. Now, there's 4 different types of, I say, board meetings. One is organizational meetings. So let me just recap on what that is. An organizational meeting is typically something that is found in your bylaws, and it is a meeting that takes place after the annual meeting. Sometimes it'll say exactly when it's supposed to happen. Sometimes it's supposed to be immediately after the annual meeting. Sometimes it's within 10 to 30 days after the annual meeting. And the purpose of that meeting is really for the board members and new board members, perhaps you've had an election, to come together and to discuss, again, what's taking place, transition, you turn over, those who have perhaps come off the board, provide those documents to the new board members, and then you elect your officers amongst the board members at that meeting. So again, for organizational purposes, it's a meeting that takes place right after the annual. Then you have regular meetings. Now, again, that's going to be based on your governing documents, but typically a regular meeting, it's on a regular interval. Maybe you have quarterly board meetings. Maybe you have monthly board meetings. This would, again, be something what we would consider as regular meetings. And these are a great use of, using the best aspects of Robert's rules. Then we have special meetings. Special board meetings are those meetings that are called, again, for a special purpose or specific purpose, usually by the president or by 2 of the directors or by a majority of the board, something along those lines. All of that will be found in your governing documents for guidance. But again, this is an example, also a good use of where Robert's rules would come into play. And then lastly, of course, board meetings, we have executive session. Now, executive session is a board meeting that is really to be taken away from all other members, and it is for very specific purposes, usually for confidential, for the sharing of confidential information or privileged information amongst the board members. It's not something that can be shared with all of the members of the community at an open board meeting, for instance. Easy example, there's a lawsuit filed against someone. You can't necessarily talk about that specific person in that lawsuit in great detail with other members, but you can, of course, talk about that with within the board members themselves. So that would be a good reason to go into executive session. Also, too, I have committee meetings as being an example. You may have several committees in your community. You might have a social committee or a parking committee. You may have an architectural review or control committee. This is also a good opportunity. I think it's very underused. I will say this. I feel like committees don't always think about how formal they could be, and meaning that they could actually conduct meeting, have business. A lot of times it's done outside of the meeting via email or charts or spreadsheets or things of that nature. It might not be as formal as a meeting, but really committee meetings would be a great opportunity to use Robert's rules. And both of these are highlighted. And I think actually, Josh, if you hit it one more time, you'll see the reason for the asterisks. These are under Robert's rules called informal meetings because they're usually under 12 people. That's just Robert's rules. Is informal is under 12. I think I said 15, so I'll correct myself now. It's under 12. You can go to the next slide, Josh. And again, we've been talking about when and where to use it. Again, as a recap, keep in mind, in light of COVID, in light of the last, 2.5, almost 3 years at this point, we weren't thinking about virtual meetings before then. I'm going to be honest. I don't think I attended any virtual meetings before March 31st of 2020. And I have been attending so many meetings since then, as probably you all have, increased your meeting, virtual meeting consumption as well. But where do we use it? We use it at in-person meetings. You can use it in electronic virtual meetings is what I'm kind of getting at. All of these can be used so frequently now, but especially utilizing Robert's rules, that can be done in either format, whether it be in-person or electronic. Josh, if you can go to the next slide for me. All right. So really quick recap. Of course, we've talked about, why do we have it? Do we have to use it? Do we absolutely have to use it? And then we kind of said, where and when do we use it, right? What are the meetings? What is kind of the format that we would have? Now we're going to get into kind of the more fun part and the how. How do we actually use this? And we're going to go into the basics. And the basics mean we have to talk about definitions first, so we all are on the same page. And then we are going to build on that with actual examples and then some cheat sheets so that you can actually use this in practice for your benefit. So Josh, if you can go ahead, let's go over. We're going to talk about all of these basic definitions one by one. All right. All of these are in Robert's rules. You all probably are all familiar with them in some form or fashion, but we got to quickly review them now. Okay. So let's go into the next slide, Josh. Assembly means group organization, right? We kind of know this. You know this. You feel confident with this one. Example, our association, our nonprofit corporation membership, that would be considered an assembly. If we go to the next slide, we're going to talk about motions. Now, a motion is a formal proposal by a member of the assembly group. Oftentimes, a motion, at least for purposes of what we're doing, we're not doing severely detailed, congressional motions here where we're, adding and we have incidental motions. We're usually doing main motions. But keep in mind, and this is something I've seen and I've actually had to correct in real life, is the president or the chair is really not supposed to make motions. That's not their job. Their job is to restate. Their job is to, allow, basically allow for people to have an opportunity to speak, to acknowledge them, etc. They're not supposed to be actually making the motions. Oftentimes when I'm in a meeting, I always tell them I'm not running the meeting, I facilitate the meeting, and I will suggest the motion that needs to be made. And when I suggest it, then I usually turn to the assembly, I turn to the members and say, we probably need this or another board member, but I don't want the president to be the one to actually make the motion for me. Here's going to be an example that we talk about just so that we have some sort of example. I move that we build a new dog park in our neighborhood. So we're going to do this. I don't know about you, but I've certainly seen quite a few people who have wanted to utilize common space, maybe have a dog park, change it. So we're going to just use that example just for how we will do these motions. So let's say that is going to be our motion. Josh, if you can go to the next slide for me. We have to have a second. If you do not ever have a second, the motion fails. We know that, right? We know that if no one seconds anything, we can't go forward. So it fails at that spot. But if you do have another member who agrees with the motion as it is stated and like it to be considered, they have to say, I second the motion or second. Okay. So next, let's go to the next slide for me. The big one, of course, is amendments. We're going to go talk about kind of our main motions. But again, amendment just means that we're modifying or adding to a motion that has already been submitted but not voted on, right? So we're going to either remove words, we're going to add words, we're going to swap words, substituting. These are all typical things that should happen per Robert's rules. Now, I'll be honest, sometimes some communities like to, maybe are a little, lax about this. But again, it's really important to make sure we know what people are voting on, and stating and restating or amending is really important to do. Let's go to the next slide for us. The next slide is quorum. Okay, we know quorum. I know you know quorum, but the quorum basically means it is the bare minimum number of voting members who are present for any business to be conducted. Now, of course, your governing documents, it's always specific. I can't tell you necessarily if it's going to always be in person or by proxy. That's what's going to be in your governing documents. But I do give some examples. Sometimes it has to be in person. It has to be those members that are present. Other times proxies might be allowed for establishing quorum. You got to check your governing documents for that. For the next slide, we have the president and chair, right? Usually it's the elected officer of the organization. The president or chair, however they want to be, they lead the meeting, right? And we typically see that in our governing documents under the president role, is that they're going to lead it. And they should be provided with that sort of higher title of Mr., Madam, or Chair. That's how they should be, Mr. President, Madam President, Chair. These are titles that should be given to the president when we are in that sort of formal formal meeting, like an annual meeting. But again, a president does not debate or submit their own motions, right? They are there to get engaged, make sure people are being acknowledged, and to be able to make sure everything is restated before we call the question, which I'm going to explain to you what that means. But basically, you're going to ask for the vote to be taking place. So let's go to the next slide. Now, I'm going to touch upon this a little bit more, just because, again, I think the president's role is so important. I think every officer is important. Let me just be very clear with that. Every officer is incredibly important. I do think the secretary is probably the second most important. That's just me. I know the treasurer, any treasurers out there who are hearing me are probably thinking like, oh, my job is the most important. Financially, from a fiduciary responsibility, it is incredibly important. But truthfully, for running meetings, keeping agendas, keeping minutes, president and secretary have very important roles. And I never want to minimize them. And I really want to always make sure that the people that take those roles on really understand what they are taking on, because it is so crucial and pivotal. The president chair has to call the members to order, right? You're going to call that meeting, establish when that meeting is going to start. It's going to start at 7:02 p.m. as I'm looking at my clock right now. And then you establish that quorum, whether or not we have established quorum at that call of the meeting. You're going to announce purposes and topics of the meeting. You're going to facilitate, announce results of any vote. So it's very important that you are the one keeping that organization. So again, I can't stress enough the importance of the president and chair. But the next slide goes into a little bit more detail. So if you can go to the next slide, Josh, for me. What presidents also have to do is keep disruptions and distractions at a minimum. I don't know about you, but one of the benefits that I have seen in virtual meeting formats is the ability to mute people. I don't know if you have any sort of enjoyment out of it. I certainly do. Where if someone is being disruptive or being distracting or asking more questions and we're not giving other people a chance, being able to mute them can be, something that is nice. Now, it's a little bit different in the in-person context. But I have also seen situations where, depending on the level of disruption that someone we have to ask them to leave, and if they do not wish to leave, then we have to contact law enforcement to do so. We never want to resort to that. Let's be honest. I've only ever had it happen to me once in the 13 years I've been at Luter, but I will say that it can happen. We always want to try to keep that at a minimum, and that really is the president's job to do that. They also have to keep direction of the meeting on topic according to agenda. So again, sometimes having proposed timeframes for your agenda and what you're planning to cover can be very helpful that way, so that you can keep on task. Josh, if you can go to the next slide for me. And of course, the basic definition of officers, of course, is that it's a member that holds additional duties and responsibilities. They can make motions, discuss, and vote. So I have a lot of officers. I have a lot of other, the vice president, the treasurer, the secretary, members at large, any director, really, absent whoever is the president, can make motions and discuss and vote. And certainly that's who I like to turn to when in doubt, especially if the membership is kind of being more quiet, that they can do that. They can take up that step. And remember too, Robert's rules state that all meetings should have at least 2 elected officers, a president and secretary. Now, that's Robert's rules. Remember, our governing documents will typically also provide for that, in addition to other officers as well. Next slide for me, Josh. As I mentioned, I know I focus a lot on president and secretary in this particular presentation. I am not slighting, I promise, the vice president and treasurer in any way, but these are really important for meeting purposes. Secretary has a super important job of taking minutes. And I can't stress to you how many times I will meet with clients and they still struggle with the minute taking and doing that. It is so pivotal to have board records, or I say meeting minutes and board records, board resolutions. It is so important to keep records of this nature. So that falls to the secretary. Taking minutes as a record for the meeting, submitting for approval, and circulating when approved. Again, that's usually part of, especially for having regular meetings, that will take place. Even at your annual meeting, if you have gotten quorum in past years, you should be moving to adopt the previous year's annual meeting minutes at the next meeting if you have quorum. It's something that gets overlooked a lot of times, but it is actually something Robert's Rules says and should be done. So just keep that in mind for going forward. You want to look after and manage records, reports, and official correspondence, proxies, waivers, ballots, resolutions. It all falls within that secretary's job. It's so important. I'm so grateful for secretaries for what they do in the association context. Josh, you can go to one more slide. I have one more slide regarding the secretary. Again, you're keeping the bylaws rules available for reference. Sometimes, especially for a lot of self-managed communities, keep in mind that you have to be mindful that members may want to ask for documents, and really that's kind of the secretary's job to be able to share that. You may have a website, you may have a way of being able to share that online with them, or if you are managed by Heritage, you may be able to go into their portal and be able to see those documents as well. But just keep in mind that when in doubt, the secretary is responsible for kind of being the gatekeeper there. And of course, preparing the agenda, order of business, and relevant notes. That's actually really the secretary's job, at least per Robert's Rules. I do have a lot of presidents who go ahead and do it anyway, but just keep in mind, if not, you can work to making sure that the secretary is the one to do that. Josh, if you can skip 2 slides, because I know we don't get to have the videos for today, so I do apologize that they're not working. Oh, they are.
I'm very worried about how this is going to end.
If they ever find out about these meetings, we're all in trouble.
This video will show you how to correctly make a motion under Robert's Rules of Order. A main motion is the way you bring any particular subject or issue before a meeting of the members for its consideration. In order to make a motion, a person must first obtain the floor by standing up or raising their hand and being recognized by the person in charge, who is called the chair. You should then address the chair respectfully by saying President, Mr. President, or Madam Chair. Or you could ask the chair how they would like to be called.
Mr. Chair.
The chair then recognizes the person, which gives them the floor.
Amik has the floor.
The mover of the motion now has permission to speak, and nobody else can speak as long as she has the floor.
I suggest, to avoid suspicion, we meet after midnight from now on.
To properly make a motion, you really should begin with, I move that.
Oh, sorry. I move that, to avoid suspicion, we should meet after midnight from now on.
After the person with the floor makes their motion, they may simply sit back down.
Didn't you hear him?
Who?
The voiceover guy.
Now at this point, we don't know who did it, do we?
No, but that's what this chapter's all about.
Can't wait to finish this.
Oh, there's only one thing left to do. Chug.
Chug, 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 chug,
Chug, chug, chug, chug, chug, chug, chug, chug, chug, chug, chug, chug, chug, chug, chug.
There's healing. Any asparagus left?
Brought to you by OPSU, Ontario's Union for Changing Times. What are you, Newton?
So for everyone who is on, the reason that I put these videos, first of all, they're just kind of funny, but the reality is that Robert's Rules is not necessarily the most glorifying topic. So I have to kind of break it up just a little bit with a little bit of humor, just a little bit of something other than me talking. So bear with me. I appreciate you listening to that. Let me go back now to the steps of making a motion. So we kind of saw just a little bit of a brief kind of a role play, so to speak, of those who are how to make a motion. But really, just to summarize, you have to have a member, again, not the president, making a motion. It has to be seconded. Needs to be restated. Now, that is something that I see many times it's not happening, and I do try to do my best to correct it when I'm at a meeting. But just remember that as the president, you need to restate that motion. Then you enter into a debate. Now, that debate can be timed. You can give 15 minutes. You can move to extend it. You do those types of things. But typically, the member that makes the motion should be allowed to go first. And again, it can be timed. And then ultimately, we're going to have the president call for basically call for the vote. Restates it, ask for any sort of affirmative, and then ask for any negative. We'll go into examples too about that in just a moment. And then you announce the results. And again, that's the president that does that. So again, motion second, restate, debate, vote, announce. That's basically how we make a motion all the way through, assuming that it does get seconded. If you can go to the next slide for me, Josh, that'd be great. Now, if the assembly is in agreement, because I know that you can see this as well, if assembly is in agreement on a particular motion, please know that you do not have to always say yes votes and count how many in the majority. The president can always say, if there is no objection, we will adopt the motion to, and what they can also do is, again, just to simply say, if there's no objection, then we'll adopt this. They wait for the objections. If there's no objections, then you move on ahead and say that the motion has carried. So just keep that in mind too. If you feel like most people are in agreement on something, you don't always have to make sure everyone raises their hands or says aye. You could also do it in that context as well. Now, let's turn on to the three most important motions to know in the association context. So Josh, I'm going to have you turn to the next slide for me. There are three main ones that I want us to cover, and then I'm going to give you my cheat sheets so that you'll know exactly what to do in meetings if you want to make a motion. Number one is the main motion. It is a clear and succinct motion to bring business to assembly. I'm going to use this as my example. I move that we build a dog park in our neighborhood, specifically in the parcel adjacent to the clubhouse and the parking lot. Okay. Why is that pretty good? Well, because it actually shows what we're asking for in a very clear manner. We're not asking for a ton of things, just one thing, and showing where that's going to be located. Josh, go to the next slide for me. As I mentioned, and this does not get used very much, this is why I want to help train those who are on and those who are going to watch this after the fact, is the amendment itself. So we have to amend sometimes. And I see this a lot where it's like, well, what about this or what about that? And you'll hear the discussion, but what you're not realizing is that they're actually trying to amend the motion itself. So again, here's my example. Let's say we don't want someone makes a suggestion that they actually want it to be the children's playground. We want a playground with equipment. We have more kids than we have dogs. That's what we want. So they need to be able to say, I move to amend the motion by striking the language that says dog park and replacing it with children's playground and equipment, right? That's really what you're trying to do. But oftentimes I find that we don't necessarily realize that's what's happening. So when you see more discussion, make sure that they are saying, I move to amend and replace or change the language so that the president can restate it properly. That's number two. Let's go to number three, Josh. And then, of course, the other most important motion to know is amending the amendment. All right, so this is a focused discussion on specific change to a main motion. Let's say we have a continued discussion. So someone really wants that dog park, and you have this discussion among your membership. And ultimately, they go back and forth, but the sway goes back to the dog park. What we want to be able to do is have that member be able to say, I move to amend the amendment to restore the language back to dog park. Now, again, I know that this sounds very formal and you're probably thinking, well, do we really need to do it this way? There are ways that you can tweak it and kind of modify it a little bit, but keep in mind, if we're really trying to follow Robert's rules, this is the way to do it. I will say, though, that saying it exactly right, there's not exact right way of, making sure that you do it, but be as clear as you can, be as concise as you can, and make sure that even if there's any confusion, make sure the president's restating it. So if there is any sort of issue, make sure that it can just be restated in a way so that everyone is on the same page before you take a vote. And that's what I was reminding for the tip below. So let's go a little bit further. Josh, if you can go to the next slide for me. This is a very common thing that happens, right? You'll have a homeowner who may think or may have experience in Robert's rules or parliamentary procedure, and they interrupt. So maybe the president's talking or the treasurer's talking, and they just simply come up and start either making a motion or doing anything else. There's really only two ways that a member in the community can actually interrupt a meeting when the board is actually running that meeting, when the president or another officer is doing their reports. Two ways. One is to ask for a point of information. And a point of information is basically asking for clarification of something, right? Maybe we didn't understand what was said, or we didn't get that specific number from the budget. We just need a point of information so that we can get clarification on where we are in that part of whatever discussion it is, right? Just clarification. The other is called a point of order, right? A point of order is usually when someone is going to say, we are not doing something correctly. We are not following a procedure. Perhaps maybe we're not amending a motion properly, or perhaps we have not restated properly. Point of order is going to come in that situation. I've been to many meetings where I've heard point of order come in, and I would say probably about 50 to 60% of the time, a little over half, it's probably correct. The person who is actually saying point of order is actually, there is an incorrect procedure that does need to kind of be fixed. Sometimes people will say it, but there's not necessarily a rule that's been violated or pointing out an incorrect procedure. So again, but these are the two reasons. Other than that, no member should interrupt the president or any other officer who is currently speaking or giving a report. There shouldn't be that sort of level of interruption. These are really the only two ways to do it, and they are the proper ways under Robert's rules. Josh, if you can go to the next slide for me. Actually skip this one for me, just so that for time purposes. In an association context, meeting format should look something like this. Now, you might have a provision in your governing documents that gives you this exact kind of agenda, but just remember that this is the actual meeting format that's originating out of Robert's rules. It should be call to order, roll call, confirmation of quorum, review and approval of prior minutes. That has to happen because you have quorum. You do not approve prior minutes without having established quorum. Then you have new business, old business, and adjournment. So that's very clear cut. That's exactly what Robert's rule says in terms of what your meeting format should look like. If you could go to the next slide for me, Josh. Agendas, typically prepared by the secretary, sometimes the president and chair, should be given in advance of a meeting. Best practices whenever I have a client who asks is to say usually at least 48 hours before the meeting. If you can get it out a week before the meeting, that's amazing. Or more longer than that, but typically I would say at least 2 days before a meeting, the agenda should be prepared and given in advance. It should set the meeting format. It should include proposed timeframes for discussion. I highly recommend doing that. Even if you don't meet those terms, you can always extend them as needed. But it's just a great way of being able to say, where do you want to focus most of your time on? And lastly, timeframes are really for guidance only, right? They're not supposed to be set in stone, but it's really to say if we have several items in new business we really need to focus on, we want to really dedicate the majority of that time there and not necessarily on old business. We might have to table that to another discussion at a subsequent meeting. Josh, if you can go to the next slide for me. Recognizing speakers is really, really important. And I see many presidents do this so well. Meetings have to run smoothly. Meetings may run smoothly, you don't need this. So in terms of, if you really only have a few people who are speaking, or you don't have a lot of questions from your membership, or maybe you've asked for members to submit their questions ahead of time so that you can already go through all of this, you might not need to recognize speakers in the same manner. But for some meetings, they can be very contested. Some meetings can be more heated, as you could probably imagine. It's really important for the president to recognize speakers and really pay attention to when people are reaching out and putting that in context. I was just at a meeting in Camden County. I flew down to Brunswick and drove to St. Mary's this past weekend. And it was really important. It's a large community, so they're in a huge auditorium, and you could tell where some members were feeling left out because they were further back and they weren't being seen. They wanted to be recognized. What was nice in that context, though, one positive I would say is that they actually had an IT department, because again, let me just be clear, this is a community that has almost 1,100 homes, and so we had several hundred people at this meeting. They actually have like a dedicated IT team that comes and does a sound system for them, so they could have mics and they could take the mics back so everyone could hear the questions and be recognized. So again, thinking those things through is really important. The one downside was that it was just hard to see further in the back, and so some people were raising their hand and not being able to be recognized as quickly as they probably would have liked. So again, that's the job of the president. Keep those types of things in mind depending on the size of your community and where you are having your meeting. Again, unruly meetings, president may have to intervene. You may have to contact law enforcement to have someone removed if they are unwilling to not be a disruption. And I have seen that, like I said, I've had that happen one situation where it rose to that level. Oftentimes people will have their question answered and not continue to be a disruption. Next slide for me, Josh. Remember, members make motions, president doesn't. Motions always need a second or else they fail. President has to restate the motion once it's seconded. You can suggest motions. So let me be clear on this one, because I've made that point a couple of times where I say the president shouldn't be the one making motions. They can suggest motions. Same idea for me. Like if I'm attending a meeting, again, I'm not running the meeting, but I can facilitate. So I can say, do I hear a motion for this, a motion to close the vote, a motion to open nominations, those sort of things to help facilitate that meeting going forward. But after a full or timed debate, the president will call to question. That is technically by Robert's rules what you are supposed to say to seek a vote. I don't hear it all the time, but if I can try to help educate those so that we can seem like we do really know Robert's rules, that would be the proper way to say is to call to question, seek that vote, and then of course the president announces the vote after the vote is tabulated. Next slide for me, Josh. Discussions and debates, typically very much at open meetings. You have to recognize those speakers, but the president also has the responsibility to stop owners from repeating the same points. So again, lot falls onto the president. Next slide for me. Sharing minutes. Now, this may be done something if you are self-managed, you may have a system of doing this where maybe you send things out or you have a website for your community, or if you work with Heritage, you might have through the portal, you may be sharing minutes that way to members. That's a great thing to do. Just remember that technically the secretary is supposed to finish the minutes sooner rather than later. We forget things very quickly. I know I do. I like to be able to review it while it's still fresh in my mind. The secretary or the manager will distribute out informal minutes. Minutes are never formal until they are voted on at the next meeting where quorum is present. So keep in mind, even when you have meetings, you might post those. They are technically informal until they are voted on. And that includes annual meetings minutes as well. Review and approve minutes need to be kept in a specified binder within association records. Now, that's the paper copy. That's like the old school method. I certainly know that there are electronic binders. There are files where you're going to keep that for association records. I certainly recommend having that saved in at least one or two locations in case something were to happen from an electronic standpoint. Same thing for even a physical file as well. Next slide for me, Josh. All right. What about virtual meetings? We touched upon it just a little bit ago, and I'm going to touch upon it right now. If you can go to the next slide for me. So we know that they exist, but I do want to let you know that the law changed last year to allow for board of directors to hold annual, regular, and special membership meetings wholly or partially by means of remote communication. House Bill 306 went into effect. This was obviously heavily legislated because prior to and in 2020, we did not have anything in the Nonprofit Corporation Code that would have allowed for virtual meetings. What we relied upon was the emergency and executive orders by Governor Kemp that said non-essential businesses should not be having, meetings unless it, and to engage in virtual meetings where practicable. And that's really what happened. So just so you know, even though your governing documents may not specify virtual meetings, please understand that the law has been updated to reflect that. If you'll go to the next slide for me, Josh, I do want to just touch upon what do we have to do if we do have virtual meetings. Requirements. 1, all members have to be provided an opportunity to read or hear the proceedings of the meeting substantially concurrently with the meeting. Oftentimes people's connections are good, they don't have a problem. I will say I've started to add using closed caption for meetings that I do, just so that people can read it or have that transcription. I do want to just make sure that they can stay on, and that they do have any sort of connection issues, that they are able to read what is going on at the meeting. Members have to be able to participate. Now that can be through direct communication or text chat features. You have to implement reasonable procedures to verify that person is deemed present at the meeting is a member or proxy holder. So you have to have systems to do that. I actually teach a whole different course about how to do that and how to actually administer virtual meetings, especially for annual and special. So there is a way that I would suggest doing it, but there are ways to do it, and it's not difficult, believe me, but it is one thing that we have to be required to do. And there's one other thing as well. There should be a fourth one, Josh. There we go. I was gonna say, I know there's 4 in this one. You have to maintain a record of any vote or action. So what I typically say is I make electronic copies of chats and ballots, send them electronically to the client. I sometimes record a voice vote. If I'm administering the meeting, record that voice vote, not the whole meeting, just that, and save that for record keeping purposes as well. And then lastly, everybody, just as I wrap up, if you go to the next slide for me, I promised some cheat sheets. I will also provide my presentation as a PDF as well, so that you can refer back to these. But I did want to make sure that we saw a couple of this. So these are some of the most common, I say, if you want to do these things at a meeting, and I was going to say, this is in an association context, these are the most common. So if you want to ask for a vote, here's what you would say. You have to say, I move the previous question, or I move to end debate. You cannot interrupt the proceedings. That's not how that's possible. You have to be recognized. You have to have a second. There's no debate needed, and you need a 2/3 vote. You can see these examples, and I'll just highlight a few of them. I'm going to share this all with you, those who are attending today's meeting. But I do want you to be aware that these are. Here's one that we talked about with the point of order. So if you are trying to point out an incorrect procedure, let's say we have a member, they say point of order, they have to wait to be addressed by the chair. So the president has to say, okay, I've acknowledged you, so they can interrupt. There's no need for a second or debate. There is going to be an explanation, and the chair has to be able to acknowledge whether or not something has been done incorrectly and to correct it. So there's no vote that is needed for that one. If we go to the next slide, Josh, let me just show these last, because I have one more cheat sheet. Again, these are all very common. Motion to open the nomination process. For instance, let's say with the annual meeting, I move to open the nomination process. Again, you need a second. There's really no debate that's needed. There really is no vote that's needed for that. You can just go ahead and then call for nominations from the floor. If you had a nomination committee, that's when all of that takes place. Then you would have a motion to close the nomination, right? So I move to close nominations. You have that from the membership. Again, you need a second. You need a majority vote in favor. So the majority of those who are present need to move in favor of closing the nominations. Then you would go into probably, I say the nominations, you would allow for your nominees to have a few minutes to talk to the congregation, to the assembly. You move to close the voting. Then you have someone in the assembly to move to close voting. Again, you need a second, a majority in favor. And in the situation where, let's say you have a community, and you have, let's say, a 5-person board, 3 people are up for election, and you only have 3 people running. You probably don't need an election for that purpose, but you need to vote them in. You would probably do a motion to vote by acclamation, right? You're going to vote. Basically, what you're saying is, I move to vote this candidates in. And in that situation, you again need a second and you need a majority vote in favor to do that. But these are all very typical ones that I see: motion to end the meeting, motion to request information. All of these are very typical that you find in an association context. I certainly want to make sure that I shared these with you, and I will certainly share them as a PDF. I know I'm getting very close to my time. I don't know if there are questions, but I'm happy to do my best to answer any questions that come in.
So, Cindy, you've been incredibly thorough, so thorough, with the fact that we don't have any questions at this time, which I'm actually really happy about, because I thought you did a fantastic job of really starting at the beginning and explaining why certain things are important. And thank you for encouraging and reminding those that there has been legislation that has been adopted to allow us to work in a virtual environment. I remember being a manager in the days prior to 2020, and remember when electronic voting started to become popular, and we were really restricted with a lot of governing documents, because I know a lot of you out in the audience watching this probably have 20-plus-year-old governing documents, and that wasn't a way of doing business. So if there is such a positive thing to come out of 2020, that would definitely be something that has very positively impacted, governance and being able to conduct business for an association. You are coming in right at the perfect time where we actually just address a lot of these things. So I personally, and Heritage, definitely thank you for reiterating and really reinforcing a lot of the communication that we've just previously offered them. We've definitely gone into great detail, and I say that the secretary is my favorite position. I hold steadfast to that pretty tightly, just because while the president is known, the most, and again, no shade to any other director or even the members at large for that matter. It's the secretary really is so crucial, because people don't recognize, or they oftentimes forget, that they're the corporate seal of the association. So we are really big on making sure that we promote timed agendas. And so one of the resources that we're going to piggyback off of your presentation from tonight is we're going to provide all of you a Word document that is a timed agenda that actually has directions on how to take meeting minutes. So hopefully you'll be able to copy and paste. We'll give you some good tidbits of information in there. And just as Cindy indicated, I think all of you are now going to be really, really well poised going into annual meeting season. I'm sure probably most of you are going back to each other going, I didn't realize we have not been doing our board meetings the correct way. Or I didn't realize, oftentimes I get this from boards, I didn't realize how formal the process actually was supposed to be. And again, it's not that our members aren't taking appropriate minutes, and we have been probably hitting pretty hard. I've drilled into a lot of our partners that the way that they need to keep minutes is very important. What needs to be included in minutes. We've definitely suggested that they should not record their meetings. So you've done a fantastic job of reiterating a lot of the information that is really crucial. So we really appreciate you joining Heritage University. I always love it. Like I said earlier, I always love it when we have the opportunity to have great attorneys and great partners join us and be able to offer their time and education. You were fantastic. And for all of those that are joining us on replay or even live right now, if you've not had the opportunity to take a look at our YouTube page, following tonight's presentation, you will have the information. We hope that you take the opportunity to offer some feedback from tonight's presentation as well. We'll get that sent out to you directly after this recording. And again, if you have not taken a look at our YouTube page for previous classes, or if you are curious at taking a look at what we've got coming up for the remainder of the year, and I can't even believe I'm about to say this, going into 2023, please visit www.heritageproperty.com go ahead and look under homeowner resources, then go to community focused education, and you will find all of our great resources available to you. Cindy, as always, we sincerely appreciate you being such a great partner with Heritage. Thank you for lending your time and excellent expertise. We look forward to seeing everybody in the audience next time.